Hi, Nicolas from Mieghem here from the Thorax Center. I'm standing here with Roberto Diletti. We're both from the Thorax Center in Rotterdam, and we will wrap up the late-breaking trials from this year's EuroPCR meeting. I will kick off with the Orbita trial, which was a randomized study comparing PCI with a sham control in patients with stable angina. There has been a lot of fuss about this trial, a lot of presentations, also a great publication. The presentation this year showed that using PCI we will reduce significantly the amount of ischemia and also patients will have less angina. That was for me at least the takeaway. But before EuroPCR at the latest SKY meeting, I already learned that after the 6 weeks primary endpoint of the study, up to 85% of the control arm was treated with a PCI. So I think that puts something into the right perspective. That said, coronary physiology proves to be very important, and there were two other very interesting presentations during the late breaker. So Roberto, why don't you tell us something about the FAME2 long-term data and the meta-analysis?
Sure, yeah, we have also interesting data by these two studies, and in particular for the FAME2 we have long-term follow-up, and apparently FFR-guided PCI is still very relevant also in the long-term follow-up, and this was basically due to revascularization, urgent revascularization and MI, and there was some discussion about what kind of MI we can find there, and what it was seen is what they were not really periprocedural MI, but they were really what we think is a STEMI. So this proved that the FFR is still relevant over time and in the long term. And this was confirmed also by a large meta-analysis, pulling 3 large randomized trials that was showing basically the same, was confirming those data and was showing again that an FFR-guided PCI is giving us a benefit in terms of MI and revascularizations.
I think that Dr. De Bruyne and Dr. Peels deserve a lot of credit, and a lot of respect for them, because again this long-term data from FAME2 was published in the New England Journal, so congrats to them. We move on to some TAVI results from the first day.
Yes, also in the first day there was some studies on TAVI, and especially there was something on the use of pacemaker, right?
Yeah, so there was a reboot trial, which was one of the first head-to-head comparisons between SAPIEN 3 and the mechanically expanding Lotus valve. And we already predicted that the winner for the primary endpoint in terms of pacemaker would be SAPIEN 3. Still, the results were quite surprising. Up to 50% of the patients in the Lotus arm had a required a pacemaker, compared to 18% in the SAPIEN 3. These numbers are somewhat higher. They are definitely higher as what we see in our current practice. But that said, we knew that the pacemaker rate would be higher. It was reassuring that the clinical outcome in both arms were almost equal, and the paravalvular leak rate in the Lotus arm was lower. So quite encouraging data for both the TAVR platforms. Still, I think the Lotus platform has some work to do in terms of conduction disorders. Switching now to bioresorbables. So there was on the first day there was a lot of presentations on this topic.
Yes, there were many presentations from short clinical outcomes to very long clinical outcomes. Maybe we can start mentioning the AIDA, the 2 years follow-up of this study, that actually met the primary endpoint, so the non-inferiority of the BVS against Xience. But what was also interesting in the AIDA is what, of course, as we were expecting, the thrombosis rate in the scaffold arm was higher. And I think there was also an interesting data that actually the vast majority of those thrombosis were in patients without DAPT. So probably we should reevaluate a little bit the use of DAPT in patients with BVS, and probably consider long-term follow-up in those patients.
But I think BVS is no longer commercially available.
Sure.
But there is no need to be alarmed in terms of the patients who received a BVS. I think the non-inferiority was established in the AIDA, but we should not forget that the Data Safety Board stop the trial prematurely because there is this signal of more scaffold thrombosis. So there were also other data on BVS, for instance, the BVS Expand.
Yes, it was a long-term follow-up of the BVS Expand. This is a registry that is basically what we can consider an all-comer registry. And there were data after 3 years follow-up, with some patients arriving to 5 years follow-up. So it was quite a long-term follow-up. And what was relevant, I think, is that the target lesion revascularization was not that high in the end at 5 years follow-up. And also, after 3 years, no scaffold thrombosis were seen there. So this is encouraging probably for patients that already have a BVS and they are after 3 years implantation. The risk of thrombosis could be limited. Having said that, we have also other platform on top of the BVS. For instance, it was presented the BioSolve 4 study, and in that case, well, this was a limited population because it was 200 patients, so we cannot really have solid conclusion on that regard on clinical outcomes. But what we have seen is that again the target lesion failure was not that high, and also the thrombosis rate was not high. There was only one case of thrombosis there.
And I think also the MIRAS data looked very promising. So
Yes.
I think the concept of bioresorption and bioresorbable scaffolds is still valid and deserves further exploration. But it needs to mature, and definitely this will be a hot topic in the years to come. Sure. Switching to the next day, there was a lot of TAVI and structural heart presentations. Maybe I can summarize the notion. So there were 6-year follow-up of the notion. The notion was a randomized study in low-risk patients, an STS score below 3, randomizing patients to TAVI or surgery. And interestingly, at 6 years, the signals for valve degeneration were more prevalent, were more frequent in the surgical arm than in the TAVI arm. As a matter of fact, moderate structural valve degeneration was apparent in up to 23% of the surgical arm versus only 3% of the TAVI arm, versus severe degeneration was less than 1% in TAVI and 3% in the surgical arm. So these are reassuring findings, and especially since we are moving to these low-risk patient populations, it is reassuring to learn that probably the durability of these TAVI platforms, and we are talking about the first generation TAVI systems, looks quite good. Switching from the TAVI per se, there were also 2 presentations on cerebral embolic protection. There was data on Sentinel presented to look for predictors and to evaluate which patient might benefit from cerebral embolic protection. And it's clear that it's hard to predict. Basically, it is a seatbelt phenomenon. Either you wear your seatbelt and you're safe, or you don't wear your seatbelt and you might be in jeopardy. So I think that we know that cerebral embolic protection will prevent debris from entering the brain. Why not use it in all the patients? And I think the presentation on the Sentinel proved that we cannot predict who will get debris embolization and who won't, and who will get an event, a clinical neurological event, and who doesn't. That said, there was a meta-analysis, a little bit confusing to me because it was combining all the data related to embolic protection, so both deflectors and filter-based protection. There were more or less mixed results, but I think the principle is still valid. You need some kind of protection because there is embolization in all patients undergoing TAVI. There was another interesting presentation on VitaFlow. VitaFlow is a Chinese TAVI platform. Interesting there was that the study focused on a Chinese patient population. 40% of the patients had bicuspid aortic stenosis, and still the results with their platform was excellent. There was no patient with more than mild PVL, and out to 1 year the results looked very, very good. So promising results with that new platform. And then finally in the mitral space, I would highlight the Maverick trial using the Arto system. In our preview, we already alluded to the interesting concept with the T-bar and the septal anchor. Data were presented out to 1 year, and it seems to be that the results in terms of MR reduction are sustained and maintained out to 1 year. So very promising, limited number of patients, but definitely worthwhile to keep on exploring this interesting technology. I think there were a lot of other stent trials presented, but let's to finalize, just focus on renal denervation, but because probably renal denervation was the beef of this EuroPCR.
Yes, actually there were 2 studies that were on med or off med, and both they succeeded to show a reduction in blood pressure. So what is your thinking? You think that the renal denervation is going to have a new future after what we were thinking last year?
Yeah, I think this is the tipping point. I think these reductions were significant, and we are talking about ambulatory blood pressure. So this is not your office-based blood pressure. It was consistent in both patients off medication and on medication with different devices. So I think also there the concept of renal denervation is valid and also needs to be studied further in larger patient populations, because up to date we only have data on a limited number of patients, but it looks very solid to me. So that said, I think we can wrap up EuroPCR. So we are about to head home with the tallies. Roberto, thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you all for watching, and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.